There comes a moment in history when arrogance meets its brutal and definitive end. A moment when those who laughed at others' attempts to improve found themselves faced with a force so overwhelming that they had no choice but to acknowledge their own error. This is the story of how the skies over the Pacific and Europe became a flaming inferno for pilots who once considered themselves invincible. This is the story of how an aircraft born of failure and redesigned with genius forever changed the course of World War II. This is the story of the P-51 Mustang. If you are enjoying this extraordinary story, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. In the early 1940s, as the world burned in the flames of war, the United States faced a devastating problem. Its combat aircraft were simply inferior. The American fighters that flew the skies were slow, heavy, and incapable of competing with the agile Japanese Zeros or the lethal German Messerschmitts. American pilots returned from missions with horrific stories of downed comrades, of impossible maneuvers executed by the enemy, of pursuits that ended in tragedy. It was a painful and humiliating reality for a nation that saw itself as an industrial power. Japanese engineers, in particular, viewed American attempts to develop superior fighters with a mixture of contempt and amusement. To them, the Americans were good at mass production, but they would never grasp the delicate art of creating a truly superior war machine. The Mitsubishi Zero was living proof of this superiority. Light, maneuverable, capable of climbing and turning with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Japanese pilots had decimated entire squadrons with terrifying ease. At Pearl Harbor, in the Philippines, in China, in every battle, the Zero demonstrated its supremacy. Why bother with what the Americans were trying to do? But something was happening in the California deserts and in secret hangars scattered across the United States. Something that would change everything. North American aviation had been given a nearly impossible challenge by the British. They needed a new fighter, and they needed it fast. The company had only 120 days to create a prototype. 120 days to do what would normally take years. It was madness. It was impossible. And that's exactly what they did. The first P-51 Mustang to roll off the production line was good, but not exceptional. It had a sleek design and clean aerodynamics, but its Allison engine couldn't deliver the necessary power at high altitudes. The first pilots who tested it were impressed by its low-altitude maneuverability, but disappointed by its climbing performance. It wasn't the definitive fighter everyone had hoped for. It was yet another in a long line of attempts that fell short of perfection. And it was at this point that the Japanese and Germans laughed even louder. See, the Americans tried again and failed again, but American engineers didn't give up. They looked at that elegant plane and saw potential. They saw a perfect airframe waiting for the right heart. And then something happened that would change the course of warfare. Someone had the brilliant idea of taking that Mustang and equipping it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same one that powered the legendary British Spitfires. It was an unlikely union, almost an arranged marriage between American and British engineering. But when that engine roared for the first time inside the Mustang's fuselage, everyone who heard knew something extraordinary had been born. The P-51B, equipped with the Merlin, built under license by Packard, was a completely different beast. Suddenly this fighter, which struggled at altitude, could climb to 10,000 meters while maintaining speed and power. Its top speed exceeded 700 kilometers per hour. Its range with external tanks allowed it to escort bombers to the heart of Germany and back. It was fast, deadly, and tireless. It was exactly what the war needed. The first encounters between the new Mustang and enemy fighters were brutal and one-sided. German pilots accustomed to dominating the skies suddenly found themselves pursued by something they could not outrun. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, which had terrorized European skies, was now being hunted. The Focke-Wulf 190, feared for its firepower, found itself with nowhere to run. And the Japanese pilots, those who had laughed at the American attempts, faced an even more rude awakening. Let me tell you about a specific day that changed everything in the Pacific theater. It was early 1945, and P-51 Mustangs were now being deployed against Japan. The Japanese pilots, even after years of war, still retained a certain degree of confidence. They had faced the Wildcats, the Hellcats, the Corsairs. Each new American fighter was better than the last, but still they knew their adversaries. They knew their limitations, or thought they did. When the first Mustangs appeared over the Pacific, escorting the massive B-29 superfortresses toward mainland Japan, Japanese pilots climbed confidently into their Zeros and the new Ki-84 Hayate, fighters that represented the best Japanese industry could produce at that desperate stage of the war. The distance between formations was rapidly closing. The guns were being armed. The sights were adjusted. It was time to show the Americans once again who ruled the skies. But something was wrong. The Mustangs weren't maintaining defensive formation. They were accelerating. And they were accelerating in a way the Japanese had never seen before. Suddenly, before they could react properly, the P-51s were upon them. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. The American pilots, many veterans with hundreds of flight hours and dozens of victories, piloted machines that were superior in every way. Faster, better armed, more resilient. A Zero could turn tighter, yes, but that didn't matter when the Mustang could choose when to engage and when to disengage. It didn't matter when 6 .50 caliber machine guns could disintegrate the Japanese. Fighters' lightweight structure, with a single well-placed burst, an American pilot later described it as like hunting with a sniper rifle while the enemy had knives. Technically, the enemy was still dangerous if they could get close. But the Mustang simply wouldn't let that happen. It would dive from impossible altitudes, fire with deadly accuracy, and climb back up before any retaliation was possible. It was a new form of aerial warfare, and the Japanese had no answer. Japanese losses began to mount catastrophically. Experienced pilots, those who had survived years of brutal combat, began falling from the sky in flames. New recruits, poorly trained boys sent to die on suicide missions, lasted minutes. The sky over Japan became a flaming graveyard. And still the Mustangs kept coming, wave after wave, escorting the bombers that reduced Japanese cities to ashes. In Europe, the story was equally brutal. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had personally promised that no Allied bombers would fly over Germany. For years, that promise was partially kept through the blood of bomber crews who fell by the thousands. The losses were so severe that there were serious doubts about whether the strategic bombing campaign could continue. Then the Mustangs arrived. The first time P-51s escorted bombers to Berlin and back was a profound shock to the German High Command. It was impossible. No fighter had the range to do so. But there they were, red circles on their wings glinting in the sun as they danced around the bomber formations, destroying anything that dared to approach. The German aces, pilots with hundreds of victories, suddenly discovered that their experience was worth little against superior machines flown by equally determined men. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's greatest aces and Germany's general of fighters, personally flew against Mustangs. After the war, he admitted that the P-51 was the best fighter of World War II. Coming from a man who had shot down over 100 enemy aircraft, this was no casual admission. It was the acknowledgement of an inescapable truth. The Germans had lost the war in the skies, but what made the Mustang truly devastating wasn't just its technical superiority. It was what it represented. It was proof that American industrial prowess, when focused and directed properly, was unstoppable. For every Mustang shot down, 10 more rolled off the production line. German and Japanese pilots knew that even if they shot down 10 enemies, 20 more would appear the next day. It was simple, terrifying mathematics. Let me tell you about one pilot in particular, though his story represents hundreds of others. His name was Chuck, and he was 23 years old when he first climbed into his Mustang over Germany. He had grown up on a farm in the American Midwest, never having seen the ocean until he enlisted. Now he was 30,000 feet above the ground, flying one of the most sophisticated machines ever created, hunting down the best pilots Germany had to offer. On his first real combat mission, Chuck encountered a group of Bf-109s trying to intercept the bombers he was escorting. His training took over. He dove, lining up one of the 109s in his sights. The 50 caliber machine guns roared, and red tracers streaked the air. The German fighter exploded in a ball of fire. Chuck pulled back on the stick, climbing vertically in a way that would have ripped the wings off any German fighter. But the Mustang held. It always held. By the end of that mission, Chuck had 3 confirmed victories. By the end of the war, he would have 19. And he wasn't exceptional. There were dozens of pilots with similar or greater numbers. The Mustang allowed competent pilots to become deadly, and already deadly pilots to become legends. The story of the P-51 is also one of sacrifice and ingenuity in the face of adversity. The engineers who worked on it were not lone geniuses. They were teams of dedicated men and women who worked 16-hour shifts, who sacrificed time with family, who put every ounce of their energy into making that machine better. Every small modification, every aerodynamic tweak, every fuel system improvement, all of it was the result of hard work and tireless dedication. And then there were the mechanics at the front, the ones who kept the Mustangs flying in impossible conditions. On muddy airfields in England, on tiny islands in the Pacific, at forward bases in newly liberated France, these men worked in rain, snow, and scorching heat, always under threat of enemy bombing. They rebuilt engines, patched bullet holes, replaced entire systems, all to ensure that when the alarm sounded, every Mustang could take off and fight. As 1945 progressed and the war approached its inevitable end, the Mustang's dominance of the skies was total and unchallenged. Over Germany, Luftwaffe pilots knew that taking off was a death sentence. Their advanced fighters, like the jet-powered Me-262, were technically superior in sheer speed, but they were so few and so vulnerable during takeoff and landing that the Mustangs simply hunted them down in those vulnerable moments. There was no escape. In the Pacific, the situation was even more desperate for Japan. Mustangs now operated from bases on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, putting all of mainland Japan within range. They escorted B-29s that dropped their deadly payloads night after night, turning entire cities into seas of fire. And when Japanese fighters attempted to intercept, the Mustangs swept them from the sky with brutal mechanical efficiency. Japanese pilots began to avoid direct combat, preferring to attack only when they had an overwhelming advantage in numbers. But even then, losses were catastrophic. There was one specific moment, documented by several American pilots, that perfectly exemplifies the paradigm shift the Mustang represented. It was March 1945, and a formation of Mustangs was escorting bombers back from a mission over Tokyo. They had just crossed the coast when they detected a large formation of Japanese fighters climbing to intercept. It was one of the last major coordinated efforts of the Japanese Air Force, more than 50 fighters attempting a massive interception. The Mustang squadron leader assessed the situation for a moment. He could maintain defensive formation around the bombers. It was the safe tactic. But he glanced at his wings, saw those magnificent silver fighters gleaming in the sun, and made a different decision. He ordered half his formation to stay with the bombers and led the rest straight into the Japanese formation. What followed lasted less than 15 minutes, but it was devastating. The Mustangs cut through the Japanese formation like a hot blade through butter. They used every advantage they had: speed to pick engagements, firepower to destroy targets quickly, structural strength for aggressive maneuvers. When the smoke cleared, metaphorically and literally, 18 Japanese fighters had been shot down. 2 Mustangs suffered light damage. None were lost. The Japanese pilots who survived that encounter returned to their bases, shattered not only physically, but also psychologically. They had flown knowing the stories, knowing the Mustang's reputation, but stories are one thing. Facing that reality was completely different. It was like fighting an opponent who was stronger, faster, more resilient, and who on top of all that had unlimited ammunition and could call in endless reinforcements. It was no longer a fair fight. It never would be again. The supreme irony of this story was not lost on the Americans themselves. Those who had been mocked, whose initial attempts had been ridiculed, now held complete domination. The Japanese who had laughed at the Zero's technical superiority now saw their air forces systematically destroyed. The Germans who had mocked American industrial capability now faced endless waves of superior fighters. Arrogance had found its price, and that price was being paid in blood and fire over the skies of Europe and Asia. But it would be unfair to paint this as a simple story of revenge or retribution. The truth is more complex and deeper. The development of the P-51 Mustang was a testament to what humanity can achieve when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. It was proof that perseverance, ingenuity, and hard work can overcome even the most unfavorable odds. Those engineers who refused to accept failure, those pilots who trusted their lives to an untested machine, Those mechanics who kept it flying against all odds, they were all heroes in their own right, and we must also recognize the human cost of all this. Behind every aerial victory was an enemy pilot who would never return home. Many of them were young, forced to fight for regimes they did not choose to serve. When we speak of the Mustang sweeping the skies, we must remember that each victory point represented a human life extinguished in flames and terror. War, even when technologically fascinating, is always a human tragedy. The P-51 Mustang flew in many theaters beyond Europe and the Pacific. It served in close air support roles, destroying ground targets with rockets and bombs. It flew photo reconnaissance missions, capturing crucial images of enemy installations. It even participated in experimental missions, pushing the limits of what was possible with fighter technology. And in each of these roles it excelled. After the war, the Mustang continued to serve. It flew in the Korean War, where its ground attack capabilities proved invaluable against North Korean and Chinese forces. It was exported to dozens of nations around the world, serving in air forces of countries that saw it not just as a weapon, but as a symbol of engineering excellence. Some Mustangs still fly today, carefully preserved and maintained by collectors and enthusiasts who understand their historical significance, but its true legacy goes beyond victory statistics or years of service. The P-51 Mustang fundamentally changed how we think about fighters and aerial warfare. It proved that range was as important as speed or maneuverability. It demonstrated that the right combination of airframe and engine could create something greater than the sum of its parts. It showed that iterative innovation, where each version improves upon the previous, could lead to revolutionary advances. It also became a profound cultural symbol. For the generation that fought in World War II, the Mustang represented hope and victory. It was tangible proof that their sacrifice was not in vain, that the industry and ingenuity that built that magnificent machine would also rebuild a world at peace. For subsequent generations, it became an icon, a visual representation of a time when anything seemed possible if you worked hard enough. When we look at the photos of those shiny Mustangs, with their black and white invasion stripes, their artfully painted noses, their propellers slicing through the air, we're seeing more than just machines. We're seeing the result of thousands of decisions, big and small, that combined to create something extraordinary. We're seeing the work of designers who spent sleepless nights fine-tuning aerodynamic curves. We're seeing the sweat of factory workers who precisely fitted every rivet. We are seeing the courage of test pilots who flew experimental prototypes knowing that one mistake could be fatal. And when we think of the enemies who faced those Mustangs, we must do so with a nuanced understanding. Yes, the Japanese and German pilots fought for causes that history has rightly judged to be evil. But many of them were simply young men doing what they believed to be their duty. When the Mustang met them in the skies, there was no philosophy or politics. There was only metal against metal, skill against skill, life against life. And the Mustang proved superior. The transformation from ridicule to total domination took less than 3 years. In 1942, the Americans were mocked for their clumsy attempts to create a world-class fighter. By 1945, they held undisputed aerial dominance over both theaters of war. This dramatic turnaround was not the result of chance or luck. It was the result of relentless hard work, a refusal to accept defeat, a willingness to learn from mistakes and constantly improve. There's a famous photo, taken near the end of the war, that perfectly captures what the Mustang represented. It shows a formation of P-51s flying over destroyed Germany, their wings gleaming against the setting sun. Below them, cities in ruins. Above them, clear, uncontested skies. They are the undisputed masters of their domain. That photo was sent home and published in newspapers across the United States. To the Americans, it represented imminent victory. To their enemies who saw it, it represented inevitable defeat. But perhaps the greatest irony of all is this: the Mustang was created because the British needed help. They were desperate, facing the Nazi threat alone, needing any advantage they could get. They approached an American company that had never designed a fighter before and asked for the impossible. And from this unlikely union was born the weapon that would help win the war. It's a reminder that sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places. That collaboration can yield results that surpass what either party could achieve alone. The numbers tell their own impressive story. Over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were built during the war. They shot down approximately 5,000 enemy aircraft in Europe and over 4,000 in the Pacific. They flew hundreds of thousands of combat missions. And they did all this with a relatively low loss rate compared to other fighters. For every Mustang lost, multiple enemy aircraft were destroyed. It was a math the Germans and Japanese simply couldn't overcome. But behind these impressive numbers were real people. Pilots who wrote letters home before each mission, never knowing if they would return. Mechanics who worked themselves to exhaustion to ensure each aircraft was ready. Engineers who continued refining and improving even when the design was already a winner. Commanders who made difficult decisions about tactics and strategy, knowing that each choice could mean lives saved or lost. The Mustang may have been a machine, but its success was entirely human. Today, when we see a restored Mustang flying at an air show, when we hear the deep roar of that Merlin engine, we are transported back to a different time, a time of relative moral clarity, where enemies and allies were more easily defined, a time of collective sacrifice, where entire nations mobilized every resource for a common goal, a time of accelerated innovation, where the impossible became reality in months rather than years. The Mustang is a tangible connection to that era, a piece of history that still lives and breathes. And what lesson do we learn from this story? Perhaps it's that we should never underestimate those who stumble in their first efforts. The Americans failed repeatedly before creating the Mustang. Each failure taught them something. Each mistake informed the next attempt. The Japanese and Germans, so certain of their superiority, made the fatal mistake of assuming that initial failures meant fundamental inability. They laughed when they should have paid attention, and when they finally realized their mistake, it was too late. Or perhaps the lesson is one of perseverance. The engineers and pilots who developed the Mustang could have given up after the disappointing performance of the first versions. They could have accepted that some nations simply made better fighters. But they didn't. They kept trying, experimenting, improving. And eventually, they created something that surpassed even their most optimistic hopes. Or perhaps it's about the importance of collaboration. A British engine in an American airframe, flown by pilots from both nations and many others. No single nation created the Mustang. It was truly an international effort, united by the common goal of defeating tyranny. In that collaboration lay strength no single effort could match. As we come to the end of this story, it's important to reflect on the full cost of what was achieved. Yes, the Mustang was a technological marvel. Yes, it changed the course of the war. But that change came at the price of tens of thousands of lives, both friend and foe. Each aerial victory represented a pilot who would never return home, a family who would receive the devastating news. War, even when fought with the most magnificently designed machines, is always a human tragedy. The P-51 Mustang remains, to this day, one of the most iconic fighters ever built. Its silhouette is instantly recognizable. Its sound is unmistakable. Its story is inspiring. But more important than all of this is what it represents: the human capacity to face impossible challenges and overcome them through ingenuity, hard work, and a refusal to accept defeat. Let's delve even deeper into this extraordinary story, because there are layers of meaning that still need to be explored. When we talk about the Mustang, we're not just talking about an airplane. We're talking about a complete transformation in how wars are fought, how battles are won, and how air superiority defines the outcome of entire conflicts. Consider for a moment the situation in 1943. The war was at its most critical point. The Nazis controlled most of continental Europe. Japan dominated vast stretches of the Pacific. The United States and its allies were fighting on multiple fronts, stretched to the limit of their capabilities. And in the skies, the situation was desperate. Allied bombers were being shot down in alarming numbers. Daytime bombing missions, considered essential to destroying German industrial capacity, were resulting in such severe losses that some generals recommended suspending them altogether. Imagine being a young aviator back then, climbing into a B-17 or B-24, knowing the odds were stacked against you, knowing that with every mission, you had a significant chance of not coming back, knowing that the German fighters would come, that they would attack mercilessly, and that your only protection was your own cruise machine guns and perhaps a few escort fighters that could only accompany you part of the way. It was terrifying. It was almost suicidal. And yet these men climbed, mission after mission, because they believed in the cause they fought for. So imagine the relief, the absolute hope, when these same airmen first saw the Mustangs coming. Not just escorting them to the German border and back, but staying with them, all the way to the target and back. It was like a miracle. Suddenly, when the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs appeared, Mustangs were there to meet them. When the German twin-engine bombers attempted head-on rocket attacks, the Mustangs intercepted them. Bomber losses dropped dramatically. Morale soared. The war, which had seemed like an endless struggle against impossible odds, suddenly seemed winnable. There's a particularly moving letter written by a B-17 gunner to his family. He had flown 23 missions and seen half of his original squadron destroyed. He was biding his time, coming to terms with the fact that he probably wouldn't survive the 25 missions required to return home. Then, on his 24th mission, he saw Mustangs for the first time. He described how one flew so close to his turret position that he could see the pilot wave to him. He described how that Mustang then accelerated and intercepted an Mi-110 that was lining up for an attack. He described the tears that streamed down his face as he realized that maybe, just maybe, he really would return home. And he did. He completed his 25 missions and lived to be 92, always keeping a photo of a P-51 Mustang in his wallet. These human stories, these personal connections, are what truly define the Mustang's impact. Yes, the statistics are impressive. Yes, the technology was revolutionary. But in the end, what really mattered was that young men were returning home to their families, that widows weren't being raised, that children weren't growing up without fathers. The Mustang saved lives, thousands of them, and that is its most important legacy. But let's also talk about the other side of this equation. Let's talk about the German and Japanese pilots who faced these machines. It would be easy to paint them as mere enemies, as faceless targets, but they were also human. Many were young conscripts, forced to serve under totalitarian regimes. Many were simply defending their country the way they knew how. And when they faced the Mustangs, they faced not only superior machines, but a terrifying realization: they had lost. There are accounts of veteran German pilots, Hasses with dozens of victories, who simply refused to fly at certain moments because they knew it was certain death. Not out of cowardice, but out of pure pragmatism. They had seen comrades, friends, even more seasoned veterans, shot down by Mustangs. They knew that skill and experience were no longer enough when the enemy had overwhelming technological advantages. It was an impossible position, a choice between certain death in the sky or court-martial on the ground. In Japan, the situation was even more tragic. As the war progressed and its losses mounted, Japan began using increasingly less trained pilots. 16- and 17-year-old boys were thrust into cockpits after just a few hours of training and sent against veteran American pilots flying Mustangs. It was pure slaughter. Many of these young Japanese pilots never stood a chance. They barely knew how to fly, let alone fight against one of the most effective war machines ever created. And yet they went anyway, because that was what was expected of them, because their culture demanded this sacrifice. When we think about these stories, the Mustang becomes more than just a symbol of American victory. It becomes a testament to the sheer brutality of war, to how technology can amplify both heroism and tragedy. Each Mustang victory was an American life potentially saved, but it was also an enemy life definitively lost. It was a cold, cruel mathematical equation that determined who would live and who would die. The engineering behind the Mustang also deserves a deeper look. What truly made it so special? It was a combination of factors that together created something extraordinary. First, there was the aerodynamics. The Mustang had one of the cleanest fuselages of any fighter of the era. Every line was smooth, every surface optimized to reduce drag. The ventral radiator, initially seen as a potential problem, was so cleverly designed that it actually created a small amount of thrust through the Meredith effect, using the heated air to generate additional thrust. Then there was the fuel system. Mustangs could carry disposable fuel tanks under the wings and in the fuselage, allowing for extended range. But more importantly, they had a fuel transfer system that allowed pilots to use fuel from the external tanks first, keeping the internal tanks full. This meant that if they encountered combat, They could jettison the external tanks and fight at full capacity. But if the mission was peaceful, they had the range to go extremely far. The armament was another critical point. 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing with a total of 1,800 rounds. These weapons were absolutely devastating. A 2-second burst from all 6 guns could disintegrate lighter fighter structures, and the weapon's convergence was adjustable, allowing pilots to choose whether they wanted maximum concentration at close range or a more spread-out pattern for larger targets. It was a simple, robust, and deadly system. The Mustang's structure was also revolutionary. It used a semi-monocoque construction, where the outer skin carried part of the structural load. This allowed for a lighter structure, without sacrificing strength. The laminar wings, with their thin, efficient profile, were incredibly strong and allowed high speeds with less drag, and the entire fuselage was assembled with almost watchmaking precision, ensuring that every aircraft that rolled off the production line had the same exceptional flight characteristics. But perhaps the most underrated aspect of the Mustang was its reliability. In a war where proper maintenance was often impossible, where spare parts were scarce, where mechanics worked under terrible conditions, the Mustang simply kept flying. Its Merlin engine, despite being complex and high performance, was surprisingly tolerant of abuse. It could operate on inferior fuel. It could survive minor damage and keep running. It could fly mission after mission with minimal maintenance. This reliability meant more Mustangs were available for more missions, maximizing the impact of each aircraft produced. And then there was the human factor in production. The factories that built Mustangs were largely staffed by women, as most of the men were serving in the military. These women, many with no prior industrial experience, quickly learned to execute complex tasks with precision. They worked double shifts, sacrificed time with family, and dealt with the anxiety of having husbands, brothers, and sons at war. And they built the Mustangs with pride and care, knowing that every well-placed rivet, every perfectly aligned joint, could mean the difference between a driver coming home or not. There's a particularly touching story about a woman named Mary who worked on the Mustang production line. Her husband was a fighter pilot in Europe. She didn't know exactly what he flew, but she knew they were fighters. So she treated every Mustang that passed through her hands as if her husband would fly it. She double-checked every connection. She made sure every panel was perfect, and she wrote little messages inside the access panels, messages of hope and encouragement for the pilots who would fly those aircraft. Years after the war, a veteran contacted the factory looking for her. He had found one of her messages, and it had given him strength during his most difficult times. He wanted to thank her. Sadly, Mary had passed away years before, but her daughter was in tears upon learning that her mother's work had made such a profound difference. These stories, these human connections intertwined with metal and engineering, are what make the Mustang truly special. It wasn't just a machine. It was a physical manifestation of the collective effort of millions of people, all working toward a common goal. Every Mustang that flew carried with it the hopes, fears, and determination of everyone who had touched it. Let's also consider the Mustang's psychological impact on those who saw it in action. For the Allies, it was a source of immense pride. It was tangible proof that Allied industry and ingenuity could produce superior weapons. It boosted the morale not only of the military, but also of civilians at home who read about their victories in the newspapers. The Mustang became a symbol of unshakable hope, a promise that victory would eventually come. For the enemy, the impact was opposite but equally powerful. The Mustang became a symbol of inevitable defeat. German pilots began to develop what some military doctors called Mustang neurosis, a form of combat anxiety specifically related to encountering that particular fighter. Some pilots began complaining of imaginary illnesses to avoid missions. Others developed tremors or sleep problems. The mere knowledge that Mustangs were operating in their area was enough to cause significant psychological distress. In Japan, where military culture emphasized absolute courage and fearlessness, admitting fear was unthinkable. But even there, the impact was palpable. Diaries of captured Japanese pilots revealed a profound terror of the Mustangs. Some wrote farewell letters before each mission, certain they would not return. The casualty rate was so high that new pilots often survived no more than 2 or 3 missions. It was a war of attrition that Japan simply could not win. The The Mustang's superiority also forced interesting tactical changes. The Germans tried several approaches to neutralize the Mustang's advantage. They developed high-speed attack tactics, where they would dive onto bomber formations, strike quickly, and then retreat before the Mustangs could react. This worked occasionally, but losses were still prohibitive. They tried saturation attacks, sending large formations that they hoped would overwhelm the defenders. But the Mustangs were so effective that even when outnumbered, they could inflict devastating losses. The introduction of German jets, particularly the Me-262, was a desperate attempt to regain air superiority. And technically the 262 was superior in sheer speed, but it had so many operational limitations that it was never truly effective. It was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, when its slow speeds made it easy prey for patrolling Mustangs. Its range was limited. Its reliability was terrible, and there were very few of them. Mustang pilots quickly learned to simply wait near the Me-262's known airfields and attack them when they were most vulnerable. It was a brutally effective tactic that neutralized much of the German technological advantage. Meanwhile, the Japanese tried even more desperate tactics. The development of kamikaze attacks was, in part, a response to the futility of conventional air combat against superior aircraft like the Mustang. If they couldn't win in air-to-air combat, the Japanese command reasoned, perhaps they could inflict enough damage through suicide attacks to make the Allied advance too costly. It was a desperate tactic, an admission that they had lost the battle for air superiority. And yet, Mustangs and other Allied fighters destroyed most of the kamikazes before they could reach their targets. The Mustang's own evolution during the war is also fascinating. The P-51D, the most widely produced variant, incorporated improvements based on feedback from fighter pilots. It featured a bubble canopy that offered all-round visibility, eliminating the deadly blind spot of previous models. It featured 6 machine guns instead of 4. It had a better targeting system. It had a reinforced structure to support heavier combat loads. Each of these improvements seemed minor individually, but together they transformed an already excellent fighter into something even better. And even when the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the Mustang remained essential in the Pacific. The final missions over Japan, those preceding the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were all escorted by Mustangs. They ensured that the B-29s could complete their devastating missions without significant interference. Some argue that the Mustang, by ensuring total air superiority over Japan, made conventional bombing so effective that atomic bombs were almost unnecessary from a purely military standpoint. It's a complex and controversial debate, but it demonstrates how crucial the Mustang was to the final war effort. After the war, when there was finally time for reflection, many former enemies came to deeply respect the Mustang. Captured German pilots who had the chance to fly it were impressed by its ease of handling and performance. Some admitted that if the Luftwaffe had had access to Mustangs, the war might have had a different outcome. It was a remarkable acknowledgement from adversaries who had lost everything fighting that machine. The Mustang's technical legacy also extended well beyond the war. Many of the design principles that made it so successful influenced subsequent generations of aircraft. The emphasis on clean aerodynamics, fuel efficiency, and reliability over excessive complexity all became part of the fighter design philosophy that persists to this day. Modern engineers studying the Mustang still find relevant lessons about how to design effective aircraft. And then there's the enduring cultural aspect. The Mustang has appeared in countless films, books, games, and other forms of media. It has become synonymous with World War II aerial heroism. When people unfamiliar with aviation think of fighter planes from that era, many automatically picture a Mustang. This cultural penetration is rare and speaks to the profound impact the aircraft had not only militarily, but also on the collective imagination. For the pilots who flew it, the Mustang remained a defining part of their identities for the rest of their lives. Veterans' reunions often included stories about the Mustang. Some pilots, decades after the war, paid fortunes to fly restored Mustangs, just to feel that powerful engine again, that precise control response, that feeling of being in control of something truly special. Tears were common on these occasions, tears of nostalgia, of loss for comrades who never returned, but also of gratitude for having survived and pride in having flown that magnificent machine. When we look at the full story of the P-51 Mustang, we see much more than just a chapter in military history. We see a perfect demonstration of how determination, innovation, and hard work can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. We see how international collaboration can create results that exceed what any nation could achieve alone. We see how technology, when applied with a clear moral purpose, can change the course of history. And we see how machines, however impressive, are ultimately just tools in the hands of human beings who make choices about how to use them. Those who laughed at America's initial attempts learned, in the most brutal way possible, that underestimating human potential is always a mistake. When the Japanese and German air forces burned in the skies under the cannons of Mustangs, they learned this lesson too late. The sky, which had once belonged to them, now had new masters, and these masters were here to stay. But in the end, this story isn't really about machines or wars or victories. It's about people who faced absolute evil and did what was necessary to defeat it. People who worked themselves to exhaustion in factories to build weapons of freedom. People who took to the skies knowing they might not return, but going anyway because they believed there was something greater than themselves worth defending. People who, faced with the impossible, found a way to make it possible. The P-51 Mustang was the instrument of their victory, but it was these people who truly won. Their stories, their courage, their sacrifice, these are the true legacies we must preserve and honor. And as long as there are still those who remember, who tell these stories, who look up when a restored Mustang flies overhead and feel that connection to an extraordinary past, this legacy will live on. May we always remember this story not with glorification of war, but with profound respect for the sacrifice of those who fought, the ingenuity of those who created, and the hope that such a conflict need never be repeated. May we recognize that freedom is not free, that it was bought with the blood of ordinary heroes who did extraordinary things, and may we keep alive the memories of those who fell, both friend and foe, for they were all human beings trapped in the tragedy of war. I deeply thank the Lord God for allowing these stories to be preserved, for guiding those who fought for justice, and for granting wisdom to those who worked tirelessly to create tools of liberation. May He bless the memory of all those who served. May He comfort the families who lost loved ones. And may He grant us all wisdom to never forget the costly lessons this generation learned. May the Lord God illuminate our paths so that we may always choose peace when possible, but have the strength and courage to stand up for what is right when necessary. May their stories never be forgotten, and may their sacrifice never be in vain.